Hey guys, my name is AJ, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about blockchain technology. So I'm going to talk about what is blockchain, how does it work, and how can it be a solution to a lot of the issues that we face with modern online infrastructure today. So in order to understand blockchain technology and how it's an improvement compared to the current technology that we have to understand how the current technology works. So think about all of the online services you use on a day-to-day basis. Think YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, it could be whatever. Those services all operate on what's called a centralized infrastructure. And what this means is that whenever you are accessing one of these services, you are accessing it from the perspective of a client. So your laptop, computer, phone will be running a client software such as the Instagram app or even a web browser. And through this client, you will be making requests to a centralized server. Now, this server can be just one computer or it could be many computers, but whether it's one or many, they're all controlled and operated by a centralized entity. So, YouTube, for example, if you want to play a YouTube video, you would be making a request to YouTube's infrastructure or Google, however you want to envision it. You would be making a request to one of their computers and asking them for that video. Same thing if you want to upload a video, you send the files to them, they store them, and now any other client can then go and request that video for viewing. So a common issue with this is that the centralized entity that controls the server will have complete and utter control on what they want to host, what they want to keep, what they want to delete from it. So they can essentially control whatever content a client will be able to access, right? If there's something inappropriate, they'll be able to take it down. If it's something that goes against their guidelines, they'll be able to take it down, and then nobody else will be able to upload anything like that or view anything like that. They have complete and utter control. So, how does decentralized infrastructure differentiate from centralized infrastructure? So, in a decentralized infrastructure, there is no one entity that will control all of the systems or all of the data associated with a particular service. So as you can see here, instead of having one server and many clients accessing that server for all the data, you will see that you have peers. Now, all of these peers will run a version of the software of the service on their machines, whether it be, a phone, a computer, whatever. And in order to use the service, you actually rely on other computers on a particular network. So you're not connecting to a company's network of computers, but you're connecting to other people like you who also want to partake in the network in order to establish a service. So an example of this would be a software called Napster. It was really popular in the early 2000s, and it was essentially a file sharing platform that was used primarily for music. So, from a traditional perspective, if you wanted to download an album or a song, you would have to connect your client to a server, and then you would have to pay to then download that particular song or album. But in a decentralized infrastructure, Napster was able to make it to where if one peer on a network, it could be any of them, if they had access to the file of a song or album, you could just download it directly from them. You wouldn't have to go through a centralized entity and purchase it. You can just download it from somebody else who already has it. So in an infrastructure like this, it makes it very hard to control what's able to be accessed. Because if YouTube doesn't want a video to be displayed, or maybe even a comment to be displayed, they can control whether or not it will be accessible. But in a decentralized infrastructure, if one peer on the network doesn't agree with something and they don't want it to be accessible, that doesn't mean that another peer can't make it accessible. So, assuming a network is large enough, that it some things become um, unmanageable to a certain point to where you can't control what's going on. So now that I've gone over a little bit about centralized infrastructure and decentralized infrastructure, um, in order to explain how blockchain infrastructure works, because blockchain is decentralized, but it kind of builds on top of decentralized infrastructure. So in order to understand blockchain, you first have to understand some basic cryptography concepts. So cryptography, when most people think of cryptography, they think about it in terms of code breaking, which that is a major part of it in terms of encryption. But most people don't know about hashing functions. So what you have here in front of you is an example of a hashing algorithm. So this is SHA-256 or SHA-256, and it's a 256-bit hashing algorithm. So what a hashing algorithm is it's sort of it's a function that takes an input, any piece of data. In this example, it's just a piece of text that says hello, and it scrambles it up using a slew of logic gates and whatnot in order to produce this output of numbers and letters. So this is a pseudo-random output, and what I mean by that is that it appears to be random, right? You could never guess that this would be the output by just looking at the input. But if you were to keep putting hello in over and over and over again, you would continue to get the same output. So the significance about these hashing algorithms is that if you change the input by even just a little bit, the resulting output is way different. So for example, we have hello, right? But if we were to even just add one O to the end of it, it would make the resulting hash much different to where you could never predict that this would be the hash just by looking at this piece of data. So now that we've talked about hashing algorithms and we understand that once you input a piece of data and generate an output, you can't get that input back, right? You can't reverse the hash. But now let's bring it to encryption. So when it comes to encryption, there's two main kinds. There's symmetric and asymmetric. So a symmetric encryption algorithm is one where you use one key or one piece of data in order to encrypt your input and generate the output. And then you use that same key in order to decrypt the output and get back your original input. An asymmetric algorithm is one where you generate two pieces of mathematically linked data, aka a private key and a public key, and you use the private key in order to encrypt your input, and then you use the public key in order to decrypt the output and get back your inputted data. So why is this so important? Because when you're thinking about a trustless, decentralized system, if you were to do something such as send a transaction of some of your cryptocurrency or execute any sort of smart contract on a blockchain, how is everybody else supposed to verify that you were the one who spent your own coins, right? Because there's no singular entity like a bank that can verify or even authorize your transaction. So how do you make sure that it was actually you who sent your coins and not somebody else? So you do this with asymmetric encryption algorithms. So if you are wanting to send a transaction, you would comprise a transaction containing an amount and then the sender of the transaction, and then you would put in the receiver of it, right? So let's say Alice is to send 10 coins to Bob via cryptocurrency, right? That entire transaction would be able to be put into a hashing algorithm, and it would have an output, and then you can then use and then Alice would be able to then use her private key to encrypt that hash of her transaction, right? That's called signing. So AKA signing, right? So when she signs that um that transaction, it has this output right here, right? This is the encrypted hash of the transaction, which was encrypted by Alice's private key. So when that transaction is now going to be distributed to every node on the network, it's going to come with two pieces of data, the original hash of the transaction and the output of the encrypted hash that was signed with the private key. So now, when every node on the network receives these two pieces of data, they will then take Alice's public key and they will then use it to decrypt this this output right here. And if they're able to decrypt it and get back the original hash, then that proves that it was signed in the first place with Alice's private key. Because Alice's private key is going to be distributed to everybody. That's the whole point of having a public key. Anybody can have it. But a private key, that is something that is supposed to be secret and seen only by the owner of that cryptocurrency, right? AKA a wallet, right? A cryptocurrency wallet. That is what manages these private keys. So anybody that has access to the public key, which can be anybody, if they're able to decrypt that data and get the resulting or get the accompanying hash back, then that's how you verify that it was even signed with that private key in the first place. So then that would be how you verify a transaction. So now that we've gone through hashing and asymmetric encryption algorithms, now let's talk a little bit about the actual blockchain specific infrastructure. So for those of you who don't know, blockchain is the easiest way to describe it would be a distributed ledger of transactions. Right. So think about how a bank works. If you want to wire somebody some money, the bank is the entity that keeps track of all of those transfers and all of those wires and decides which ones are real and fake, or real or maybe invalid or fraudulent. That is on them to decide. But how a blockchain works is taking this list of transactions and distributing it to every member of the decentralized network. So then it's not just a centralized entity that owns the list. Anybody can own the list as long as they join the network, which can be done just by downloading the software and running it. So this ledger, right? This list of transactions is comprised of these chunks of data, right? Each one of these chunks of data is called a block, hence, blockchain. So right here, all of these blocks are comprised of both a header and a body. So the body of each block is the transactions which are a part of that specific block, right? So you have a block which has a list of transactions, and then you have a list of blocks that then makes up the overall list or ledger that everybody can have, right? So the body is a list of transactions, but then if you look at the header right here, it's comprised of a few main things, right? You see we have a previous block hash, its own hash, and a nonce value. So the nonce we're going to talk about a little bit later because that has to do with mining, but don't worry about that. We're going to get to that real soon. Let's just focus right now on these two items, the previous block hash and the hash. So as we've discussed earlier, a hash can take in any number of inputs to then result in a 256-bit output. So that input could be a singular word, it could be a picture, whatever. But in this instance with blockchain technology, you can also put in all of the data of a block into a hashing function and have a resulting 256-bit output, right? So you could comprise all of the transactions, all of the metadata comprised in the header, and have that one hash output, right? If you were to change any of these transactions or this nonce value, if you were to change any of that, the entire block's hash would end up being completely different, right? So it has its own hash, but then if you look at the rest of the blocks, they all have these same um, header values, right? They all have a previous block hash and their own hash. So every block, think about kind of a linked list, right? In a linked list, every node has a pointer to the next node in line, right? But in a block, it's not particularly a pointer, but they all have the hash of the block that came previous to them. So whatever this hash value right here is, that's going to be the hash value that is right here as the previous block hash, right? Because block two, the previous block to block two would be block one. So this previous block hash is going to be the hash right here. And then this hash right here is going to, of course, be all the transactions, the nonce, and it's also going to include the previous block hash that goes into this hash. And then this block's previous block hash will then be this one, that hash right there. And then as you keep on adding more and more blocks, they will always continue to be linked to one another, right? And why is this so significant? It's significant because unlike a typical decentralized application, right? For example, if you're just downloading music or a movie from a peer, it's not so vital that all of the network data remains in one state, right? But if you're dealing with something such as transactions, right? If you have monetary value behind the state of the ledger, then you don't want that state to ever be tampered with, right? Because if you distribute um, this entire ledger of blocks to everybody on the network, what's to stop one member of the network going in and tampering one of the blocks and saying that somebody actually paid them 1 million coins? You wouldn't want that, right? So if somebody were to do that, right, if they were to change any transaction of any of these blocks, then the block hash, its overall hash, would then change when it comes time for it to be recalculated by another node on the network, right, for verification purposes. So it would then change. So, but if one block changes, if their hash changes, um, then it's not going to match up with the previous block hash for the next block that was in line, right? And then if you wanted to recalculate this block's hash to include that previously changed hash, then its own hash would be changed. And then the cycle continues. Then this one's not going to match up with this one. And then so on and so forth. The entire chain is going to be altered. And then when you try and distribute those changes to other nodes on the network, they're going to be like, wait, none of this makes any sense. This chain must have been tampered with. Right. So any transaction that has been confirmed in any of these blocks that's been verified by all of the peers on the network. That's it. Once it happens, it can't be undone. It can't be modified. Right. So this ledger, this entire list of transactions in the blockchain is append only. You can only add things to it. You can never change or delete anything on it. So in that previous slide, I mentioned adding blocks to the chain, right? And I also mentioned nonce my bad, nonce values. So I'm sure some of you have heard of cryptocurrency mining and probably wonder, so what does that actually mean to mine cryptocurrency? So in order for new blocks to be added to the blockchain, they have to fulfill a certain consensus mechanism, right? And now these mechanisms can be different across many different blockchains, but let's just go with Bitcoin, for example. If a new block is to be added to the overall blockchain, the overall hash of that block has to have a certain number of zeros at the beginning in order for it to be considered a valid block. So what miners have, what their responsibility is to select a group of transactions that are being proposed by members on the network, right? So if Alice wants to send Bob some coins, she has to propose that transaction to the entire network. And then a miner has to take that transaction, verify it, and then include it in a block that they then are planning to propose to the entire network in order for it to be accepted, right? So what mining actually is just trying to find a suitable block that will have a hash that has a certain number of zeros in front of it. So let's say, for example, that in a certain blockchain, the consensus mechanism says that you need 4 zeros in the beginning part of the hash in order for it to be considered a valid block, right? So a miner then takes a chunk of proposed transactions, puts them in a block, and then calculates the hash. But then what if the hash doesn't have the requisite amount of zeros in the beginning? Well, then that's a problem because the blockchain isn't going to accept it as a valid block, and then those transactions are never going to be processed, right? So right here, this block wouldn't be processed because it doesn't start with 4 zeros. So what you can do is, though, remember what I said about hashing, and remember what I said about how if you were to change even one thing in that entire input into the hashing function, right? So this entire block, if you change even one thing, that entire hash is going to be completely different. That's where the nonce value comes into play. This arbitrary value, typically represented by an integer, but it's completely arbitrary. Its entire purpose is to just be changed over and over and over again until a miner is able to find a valid hash that is then generated from that entire block, right? So they take all the transactions, hash them up, take the previous block hash them up, and then you start off with a nonce value of 0, that doesn't give you the hash you need. So you just keep incrementing that nonce value over and over and over again until you find the right hash. So it's not going to work with the nonce value being 0. Let's try it a few 100,000 times. Let's run that calculation a few 100,000 times. Oh, this value's, look, we've tried it 189,426 times. Still haven't found a valid hash. All the transactions and the previous block hash stay the same, but we still haven't found a valid hash yet. So let's keep going, right? On the 436,525th attempt, we've finally found a valid hash that is generated from this overall block. So now, when a miner finds this nonce value, right? They include it, of course, in the block, and then they propose that block to the rest of the network. So that all the other nodes on the network can receive that block, hash it themselves to verify that the hash is actually what the miner said it was. And then they go, okay, well, this block is valid, so let's add it to our own version of the ledger, right? So if you've heard about how cryptocurrency mining takes a lot of power and you need some really powerful computers to get it done, maybe even ones with all of these NVIDIA GPUs, that's what they're doing. It takes so much power because you're just trying to calculate something over and over and over again until you finally get something that works for the particular consensus mechanism, whatever it may be. So now that we've gone over the basics of blockchain technology, we're going to talk about some applications. And of course, I've mentioned the core applications such as cryptocurrency, seen in Bitcoin, Ethereum, but cryptocurrency was only the first application that had been thought of when it came to blockchain technology. In fact, that's why blockchain technology was created, was for the purpose of bringing a digital currency to fruition. But in more recent years, computer scientists have realized, wait, this technology is actually very applicable to other fields, and it can be used for so much more than just cryptocurrency. And that's where smart contracts come into play. I'm not going to get too in depth into smart contracts, but the general idea of smart contracts is having a contract that is enforceable, not by a singular entity, like, for example, an escrow broker or any sort of broker, but a contract that's only enforceable by the encryption algorithms that are able to determine whether the expectations of a contract have been fulfilled or not. Right, because these all of these brokers, they're middlemen and they take percentages of all these transactions, and they still have the power to determine whether something's right or wrong. But in some cases, it would be better to let a consensus mechanism that everybody can control determine whether or not a contract has been fulfilled or not. So as for this assessment, I've written a few questions here that hopefully you guys will be able to answer. So I'm going to read off every question and I'll let you guys pause the video, try to think of the answer, and I will say the answer. So first question, what are some key differences between centralized and decentralized infrastructure? Go ahead and pause the video. So some key differences between centralized and decentralized infrastructure are that in a centralized infrastructure, only one entity, whether it be a company, a government, any sort of entity, they have complete control over how the service is used, over what can be accessed through the service, whether or not they even want the service to continue or not. Meanwhile, on a decentralized infrastructure, everybody is equal in determining what is accessible, what is um, what is just best for the product or service as a whole, and they're all equal in being able to participate in that decision making. And so next question, how is blockchain different than just a regular decentralized infrastructure? I'll let you pause. So blockchain's different than just decentralized infrastructure because blockchain puts a very big emphasis on maintaining the state of some data, right? And just a typical decentralized infrastructure, that just means, a bunch of computers all communicating on a network, maybe exchanging some data, but there's no importance in maintaining a particular state of all that data, right? When you're dealing with transactions and all that, you need to make sure everything stays the same, right? You need to maintain that state and make sure that it can't be changed or deleted or modified without everybody agreeing on it. So, what is the difference between hashing and encryption? So, the main difference between hashing and encryption, they're both um, sections of cryptography, but hashing is the process of taking an input and generating an output that cannot be reversed. You cannot figure out the input of something just by looking at the output. It is one way and it is impossible to reverse it. Encryption, on the other hand, you can generate an output from an input, but then you can then decrypt the data and get its original form as long as you have the requisite keys. So if it's, oh wait, I'll get back to that. But as long as you have the requisite keys to decrypt the data, you can get your input back. What is the difference between symmetric and asymmetric encryption? So when talking about the requisite keys needed um, to decrypt a piece of data, for a symmetric encryption algorithm, one key is used for encryption and decryption. So you generate it and it can be used for both. For asymmetric encryption, you have a key pair of a public key and a private key, which are mathematically linked, and you use the private key in order to encrypt the data, and then the public key to decrypt the data. If you try to use the private key to both encrypt it and decrypt it, it's not going to work. And lastly, what is the purpose of the nonce? So as we talked about with hashing algorithms, if you were to change any bit of an input, your resulting output is going to be completely different. So when you want to take a block and you want to generate a hash that fulfills the consensus mechanism by all the other nodes to be accepted as a valid block, you can't go and change all of the transactions because then they won't be valid anymore. And you don't want to change other important parts of the metadata associated with a block because those are important. So what can you change in order um, to repeat and repeat a calculation in order to generate a valid block? You introduce this arbitrary piece of data called the nonce, and you just change that piece of data over and over and over again until you're able to generate a hash that fulfills the needs of the consensus mechanism. The nonce doesn't mean anything. It's only there for the purpose of changing. All right. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed the video. But more importantly, I hope you've learned something about blockchain technology and have gained some insight as to why it's such a promising technology. If you would like to learn about blockchain even further, I'll leave some links in the description of this video to some more online resources, and even the link to the Discord group for the blockchain protocol that I'm currently working on. All right, that's about it. Thank you for watching. Bye.